Hello and welcome into another episode of the Bonkers Cards podcast. I'm your host, Gordy Bonker, and today on the show we have an interview with author Phil Coffin, who just published his book, When Baseball Was Still Topps, and it is a collection of short essays about the 1959 Topps baseball set and what was going on historically in not only baseball, but America in the late 1950s. So really excited about this interview today. I got the chance to sit down with Phil for just about a half hour talking about the book, baseball history, his experience as an author and a writer. Phil Coffin has had a 26-year career with the New York Times. He started his career there as a writer and is now there still as an editor. Phil has a wonderful story about his experience rising the ranks through his experience in sports journalism and writing, and officially now recently publishing this book. So it was a pleasure to get to interview Phil. I think you guys are going to love this podcast episode. His book is again out now, and it is titled When Baseball Was Still Topps. And I really hope you guys enjoy it. So without further ado, here is my interview with Phil Coffin. Today I am joined by Phil Coffin. Phil is an avid baseball fan. Phil actually currently still works for the New York Times, has had a 26-year career at the New York Times, and just recently published a book on the 1955 Topps set titled When Baseball Was Still Topps. I'm really excited to get into it today with Phil. Phil, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Hey, I'm thrilled to be here, Gordy. Thanks.
Absolutely. Well, look, I know I'm super excited to talk a little bit more about the book. From my understanding, the book contains 572 essays across the 572 Topps cards, which in itself is an incredible accomplishment just to come up with 570 stories. I had the pleasure of getting to read some of these stories early, and I'm stoked today to get to ask you about some of them.
Sure.
But before we get into the conversation regarding your book, I would love to learn a little bit more about you and your background. I myself have always loved writing and journalism. And I think having somebody that has had such an incredible career at obviously the most well-known publisher in the world, New York Times, I would love to hear about your background and your career, which led up to this point in publishing this book. I mean, that's a major achievement. So, Phil, if you could share a little bit with me and the audience about you and your background, I would love to hear it.
Sure. Thanks. I grew up in Indianapolis in a family of four kids. We were all baseball fans. I had two older brothers who would allow me to go along with them to play pickup baseball. And baseball cards were a big part of our baseball fandom. And I got started in 1959, watching baseball with my brothers and collecting baseball cards with them, and spent pretty much every nickel I had on baseball cards. Perhaps not the greatest investment, but I loved it. Time goes by, mom throws the cards away, but I still love the 1959 cards. I go into journalism, and much of the time I've been in journalism, I was in sports department, so I've always had the connection. And then a couple of years ago, I started writing just for fun baseball essays on silly topics to amuse friends of mine. It was things like for Arbor Day, I wrote about players named Branch and Oak. For Flag Day, I wrote about players named Red, White, or Blue. So it was silly stuff. I went through the lineups in Jackie Robinson's first game. So those kinds of things. Then it was merely to amuse myself and my buddies. So I had done this for a year plus, and I said, I love those 1959 baseball cards. For fun, I should just write an essay about them. And maybe what I should do is just write about all the cards, forgetting that there were 572 cards in the set. So I started, and I didn't realize how daunting a task this was, because I just started with the first card, Ford Frick, baseball commissioner, and just going through the set. And it was every night I was going upstairs to the office and researching and writing. And I would tell my wife every night, I'm sorry, I'm going upstairs and going down some more rabbit holes. And after a while, she started calling this project Bunny Ball, because I kept going down all these rabbit holes. And after a while, she said, this is a book. And because I knew better, I said, no, it's not a book. It's not a book. And she insisted that, yeah, it's a book. And after a while, I realized, of course, she was correct. And that really gave me the momentum to keep going through all 572. I was fortunate enough to get a contract with McFarland and Company, a small publisher in North Carolina that has an extensive baseball catalog. Any baseball fan who wants to look at the history of baseball would do well to look at McFarland's catalog. And now we have a book out.
Yeah, well, that's fantastic. I'm noting McFarland for the audience just because, yeah, I would encourage anyone to check out some of the books that they published on baseball history. And when you and I first met, Phil, you had shared with me some recommendations for books to read, and we're going to say that to the end of this episode. But
Okay.
in terms of baseball historians and students of this game, it was very clear to me as soon as I met you. There are few that have more knowledge than you in terms of the history and the appreciation for baseball, which I'm fortunate to say that many of the viewers and audience members that are going to get to watch this and listen to this share that in common with you. So super excited to learn more about that. Now, this process, I love you share the story about your wife calling it bunny ball and her encouragement to write the book. Did you so you're at 26 years now at the Times. I understand you're an editor there still today.
Yes.
When you were earlier in your career as a journalist, were you covering sports? And a second question to that was, did you ever think you would write a book about sports?
I actually got into the business as a sports writer for a small paper in Bloomington, Indiana. And that was my goal was to be a reporter and writer. As my career developed, I moved to the editing side many years ago, and that's where I found a niche and stayed there. Always loved to write, but I sort of put it on the back burner. I never had any thought that I would write a book. And perhaps that's why I was so resistant to the idea that, oh, this is a book. Uh, it's I have friends who have written books, and I know it's not an easy process. And as many of the authors I have met since I began this would say that the writing is the easy part. The getting published is the hard part. Uh, and that's where I learned a lot about going from an idea of a book and writing the book to getting the book published.
Sure. Tell me the timeline. How long did it take from when you first started putting that, story number one about Commissioner Frick, and from that period to, finishing the book and getting that publishing deal? How long did that take?
Well, the whole process from Ford Frick to when I had the book in my hand this week was about 17 months, which is really not that long a turnaround for book publishing. The writing the book itself took to research and write took about 6 months, which, from what I understand from fellow authors, is not a long period of time for writing a book.
Sure.
It's the process of then getting a publisher and getting it out takes considerably more time.
Sure. And I'm curious to know as well, is this the first book that you have published? Because obviously getting a deal with a really credible publishing company like McFarland, it's a huge accomplishment. So was this the first experience you had actually publishing something?
Yeah, this is my first book. And I talked with some fellow authors in SABR, it's Society for American Baseball Research. I'm part of the New Jersey chapter,
I was going to ask you.
and they had some tips on how to proceed with pitching a book, and they had great advice. So I created a list of about a half dozen publishers and sent the extensive pitch memorandum to each of them. Two of the publishers I really was interested in because I know they have big baseball catalogs, and McFarland was one of them. I have way too many McFarland books myself here in the office. Every publisher on its website says we get a gazillion submissions, so don't expect to hear anything from us for at least a couple of months. And that's what I had in mind, I'm not going to hear from anybody for a while. And a buddy said, well, that's true based on his experience. He said, but if somebody sees it and likes it, you may hear from them right away. And
Sure.
sure enough, McFarland wrote back 2 weeks later and said, we find this very appealing. Let's talk. That being one of my first two choices, I was thrilled.
Yeah.
Uh, the and it's a good thing that McFarland reached out to me because none of the other publishers I wrote to ever wrote back to me.
Well, it was meant to be, it sounds
I
like.
guess so.
I had in my notes for our conversation today, one of the things that stood out about me when I met you was SABR, and speaking a little bit more about the Society of its American Baseball Research.
Yes.
So
Uh,
if you could share a little bit more about what it's like being a member of that, and potentially, are you guys open to new membership, and what does that look like?
Absolutely. It's it began decades ago, and it was a bunch of guys who were very involved, very tapped into baseball research. One of the early proponents of this research and members was Bill James, who's gone on to quite a career since then. It has developed over time. It's serious baseball historical fans, and guys and women with a really strong interest in doing baseball research and baseball history. Uh, SABR members have written so many books. There's a quarterly journal that gets put out with really interesting articles. The New Jersey chapter has regular meetings. We're doing them by Zoom, which is great because we can actually meet if we had a meeting in Jersey City. It
Right.
would be tough for a lot of people to get there, but by Zoom, so they're fun back and forth. We have really good speakers, and it helps. I think SABR itself helps focus members on baseball research and baseball topics. SABR itself has been working on a project for many years now. Their SABR Bio Project profiles, and it's biographies of hundreds and hundreds of ball players and others in the game. They're a fascinating read. They're some of them are very long and extensive, and it's not just Mickey Mantle. It's not just Hank Aaron.
Sure.
It's profiles of players that you've never heard of, and you read them and you go, "Wow, this is fascinating." And the Bio Project profiles were an unbelievably helpful source for me as I wrote the book.
Yeah, no, and that's one of the things that jumps out on the book, and I would love to speak more on the book now. But in terms of SABR, at the end of the episode, maybe we can give them one more shout out just to find out if people are interested in potentially joining our chapter. Would love to circle back to that. But one of the things that's great about the book is that exactly there are many players that you probably have never heard of that you can learn something about from their career or their life or
Yep.
their contributions, not only to baseball, but maybe society and what the things that were happening, especially in 1959, are quite culturally relevant in the expansion of our country. So
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the elements that people are going to find interesting about the book, because there's plenty of stories about Mickey Mantle. We know lots about him. But I think that's where, I love getting that opportunity to expose some of those other elements to the game. So I do see behind you, you've got a copy of the book, which I said
I
to you when
do.
we jumped on.
Mm-hmm.
I love the copy. It looks like a baseball card. It looks like there's stats that should be on the back of that. If you want to show it,
Yes.
I'd love to see it.
Yeah, there's just a little more close-up look is this is the book. Sorry, no stats, only words on the back. But it's there are tables in the book, so you can get a statistical fix. Uh,
Fantastic.
the My colleagues at McFarland came up with this concept for the book, and the premise was that it would sort of replicate what a baseball card pack in that era looked like. And having opened many of those packs, they did a great job of doing that.
Surely, surely. Well, let's get into it. I know I had read a couple of the excerpts, but I do want to give you an opportunity to describe it a little bit more deeply. So I have already shared that there are 570, I believe it's 3 essays, correct? 572 with a bonus.
572 with an extra innings.
Extra with an extra innings. And if you'd like to go any deeper into potentially some of these short essays and maybe a good sample of a story or two from the book that speaks
Sure.
out you. I would love for you to share it with the audience, get a taste of what they could potentially get if they wanted to grab a copy.
Certainly. The essays are all over the map. They range from 75 words to 700 words. It may be a little profile of the player, or it may pick out a moment of that player's career. It may use that player to talk about some other issue in the game. Norm Cash, for example, I use as one to show. Here's Norm Cash in 1959, who wound up being an excellent first baseman for the Tigers. To talk about cheating in the game, because he was famous for later for corking his bats, and so his essay talks about how he and others through the decades in baseball have corked their bats or doctored them in some way. And it's an indication that the kinds of things that we see in baseball today
Right.
have existed in one form or another for many years. Another guy who had just like the most marginal career, he was a pitcher named Humberto Robinson. And in 1959, he was pitching for the Phillies, and a gambler tried to get him to throw a game late in the season. Now, Humberto Robinson had won one game all year, and he's pitching for the last place Phillies. And a gambler reaches out to him to throw a game that they're going to lose anyway, most likely. This was not a smart gambler. Robinson, convoluted story, which you can read in the book, but winds up reporting it. Gambler is sent to prison, and Robinson actually did win that game, and it was the last win of his major league career.
Wow. That I actually, that was one of the ones that had stood out to me was, throughout baseball, we've talked about, especially with Pete Rose. I had a Pete Rose card just earlier I had over here, but, the evolution of, sorry, I'm getting a phone call. The evolution of gambling and that discussion around baseball still holds today, even in a lot of sports. Mm-hmm. I think that games are being thrown. So that is quite interesting. So you have those elements of talking about the game, some of the lightning rod topics like corking a bat or gambling, some of the players' backstories as well. One of the card that jumps out, Gus Zernial, who there he is. He's in your hand right now. I recognize Gus Zernial right away. I believe he's the second card in the 1954 top set. Now,
okay.
Or 59 tops. That's your favorite. My favorite set is 54 tops. You can see
the 54s are beautiful cards.
They really are. For whatever reason, I gravitated towards them earlier on, but I recognized that name and I was like, what does he have to say about Gus? And it shows that he actually dated Marilyn Monroe before Joe DiMaggio did. And there's a little bit more of context behind that as well. But I think, stories like this, and if you want to share anything about that, I think it's interesting that there's stories about the players' lives just as much as
right. But as I was writing the book, it was almost scary how much I knew and remembered about these players. You think about it, at the time there were 400 some players in the game, right. 16 teams, and it was frightening how much I knew about them. It was also frightening how much I did not know. And the story about Gus Zernial and Marilyn Monroe, well, it's been out there. I'd never heard it before. I mean, I have more than 200 baseball books here in my office, and this was a story that was new to me. So it was fascinating to keep coming across things that, even as much as I know about baseball, I had never heard before. And that's kind of what propelled the book, because I said, I'm pretty conversant with this era. I'm pretty familiar with these players, and I don't know these stories, and they are fun to read. So I'm hoping that those who pick up the book will also find them fun to read.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And there was another story I wanted to pick out if you had another story that you wanted to share, because what I'll also do after this podcast is published, I'll be able to upload some shorter form videos that I'll be able to share across my TikTok audience, which has a much larger audience. So hopefully people can pick up and see some of these stories. One of them is just pure baseball stats and numbers, which as baseball fans know, they love to read. And one of them is about Eddie Matthews. Eddie Matthews, to me, is a really cool guy in baseball history. He is on the cover of the 1954 Sports Illustrated magazine, the first ever edition. There you go. There's your 59 Ed Matthews. I'm going to get mine out just because I love my 54 Ed Matthews. This is my 1954 Topps.
Nice. Very nice.
One of the things I've noticed from my audience is they love Ed Matthews, and he, unless you're a baseball fan, is not always recognized right away in today's game. But man, every time I get an Ed Matthews card on the show, it's quick to go. People do love him who are hardcore baseball fans. And your book mentions that this was a guy that might break Babe Ruth's record.
Yes.
And so please share a little bit about that and, the context that the book offers on that.
It's he was teammates when he was young and with Hank Aaron, who was a year or two behind him in age, I think a year. And Eddie Matthews came on the scene and was very quickly a world-class power hitter. In his early 20s, he's hitting 40 home runs a year in an era when people just didn't hit 40 home runs very often.
Sure.
And if you, and I put a progression table in the book that shows Matthews with what he was hitting every year and his career totals. And at the ages through, I think, age 31 or 32, he's on a much faster pace than Hank Aaron was at a similar age. And it's not until into the 30s that Aaron starts to catch up with him. Now, Matthews, like many power hitters of that era, did not have a terribly lengthy career. I mean, he played 15 years maybe, but when he was 32, he was done. I mean, he was no longer productive. Yeah. Hank Aaron had another 8 years of great productivity. So Aaron catches up and passes him. But when they were in their late 20s, people pointed to Eddie Matthews. This is the guy who might break Babe Ruth's record. He couldn't sustain what he did in his early 20s. But that's part of the magic of baseball. We don't know what the career arc of anybody is going to be.
Right.
Eddie Matthews started out fantastic, was very good. Hank Aaron starts out more modestly and is tremendous forever.
Right.
In addition to their progression tables, just for fun, I threw in Barry Bonds and Alex Rodriguez to show how their progressions were. And of course, Bonds, his progression in the later part of his career is off the charts. Alex Rodriguez started off with a bang, and he was so far ahead early on. We know what happened with Bonds and A-Rod. Their careers had their own taint, perhaps. But it was interesting just to see how they matched up side by side with these two power hitters of a different generation.
No, I mean, that's something that I'm eager to read about and get to see in the book. I can remember, I grew up with A-Rod in the height of his powers. Bonds was finishing his career as I grew up, and Bonds was doing great. But, I was a Yankees fan as a little kid, and there was always constant conversation about Alex Rodriguez potentially breaking the home run record, and Albert Pujols, another name that gets thrown around as somebody that, for the first 10 years of his career, that progression for Pujols looked fantastic.
Absolutely.
So it's going to be interesting to see if anybody ever chases either of those home run records. They're going to be tough to stand. The one piece I wanted to talk about with Hank Aaron, as you were speaking about him, I brought up some of his stats, and it's truly remarkable. I mean, his rookie season was 1954, and Hank Aaron in 1973, almost 20 years later, hit 40 home runs in a season. So he was a model of consistency of hitting home runs. But what's fascinating about Aaron, and a fun fact I always bring up to people, is that he never hit more than 49 homers in a season. He never hit 50.
Correct.
Always put up great numbers each season. And that is something I don't know if we'll get to see again. But, I'm a huge Hank Aaron fan, and that's a super interesting comparison to see him between Eddie Matthews earlier in their career.
Yeah, Aaron was, you're right. He was unbelievably consistent, but he was also so good at everything.
Yeah.
We we kind of forget that because he was just a great home run hitter. But he hit for average, he hit for power. I've got let me just get real quickly here.
Sure.
The all right, in the course of his career in one season or another, great card. Aaron led the National League in games played, runs scored, hits, doubles, home runs, RBIs, batting average, slugging percentage, total bases, times on base, intentional walks, even sacrifice flies. Those are the conventional stats. He also led the league in such modern stats as OPS, OPS plus, runs created, batting runs. He won 3 Gold Gloves playing right field in an era when Roberto Clemente was also playing right field.
Right.
So the guy could play defense. In the 50s and into the 60s, most players were not stealing bases. In 1950, I think the stolen base champion in the American League stole 15 bases.
Wow.
So, totally different era. I think there was one year where the Red Sox stole like 29 bases. So it's crazy. Um, Aaron was in the top 10 in the league in stolen bases 8 times and the top 10 in triples 5 times. So the guy could do everything. There's a great quote from Aaron in Joe Posnanski's book, The Baseball 100, which fabulous read. And Aaron says, if I had to pay to go see somebody play for one game, I wouldn't pay to see Hank Aaron. I wasn't flashy. I didn't start fights. I didn't rush out to the mound every time a pitch came near me. I didn't hustle after fly balls that were 20 rows back in the seats. But if I had to pay to see someone play in a 3-game series, I'd rather see me. And that speaks to the consistency of one of the greatest players in baseball history.
I couldn't agree more, and I love that you got to share that with the audience, because he's another guy that I love talking about in terms of my personal collection. My audience is big into both card collecting and memorabilia collecting. The player that I have the most collecting of, and right behind me, I have a signed Hank Aaron ball. This is actually a signed 1956 Topps.
Oh,
And I love having Hank Aaron cards. I think he's just the greatest all around baseball player of all time. Him and Willie Mays. So that's a debate for a whole other episode for sure. And I did just get notified as well from Zoom that I have 10 minutes left on the interview.
okay.
So I do want to make sure that I get everything out in the interview before Zoom kicks us off. But in terms of the book and any additional context you want to share with the audience, I have 1 or 2 questions to follow up with in terms, as well as your recommendations. But anything else you want to share about the book?
Certainly. One of the things about the book, it's about the cards, it's about the players, it's about their stories, but there are issues from the game that are woven throughout the book. 1959 is the sweet spot for this book because of its personal connection. But 1959 sat in a very important era in baseball. Baseball had a silly rule in much of the 1950s in which any amateur player who signed for $4,000 or more had to be on the major league roster for 2 years. So, for example, and in modern times, an 18-year-old Derek Jeter would have had to been on the Yankee roster at 18 and 19. Instead of developing in rookie ball in Class A, he would have had to sit on the major league bench. So they took the best young players possible and crushed their development time. And it just ruined a lot of those players. Finally, in 1957, they eliminate that rule. 1958, the Dodgers and Giants moved west, transforming the game, major league game, to transcontinental for the first time. Totally changes the game. There have been franchise shifts in the 50s, but this is a whole different game. In 1959, a rival league is threatened. Branch Rickey, the longtime general manager, threatens a league called the Continental League. And it never got off the ground, but it was such a serious threat that baseball, very traditional, decided to make radical changes. Some franchises moved, like the Washington Senators moved to Minnesota. And that was what prompted expansion, first in 1961 and 1962, and then later in the 60s. So without the Continental League, you might not have had to push to go from 16 teams to more teams. In 1959, the last of the major league teams integrated, the Boston Red Sox, 12 years after Jackie Robinson had integrated the modern game. So this set of cards sits right in this sort of cauldron of things that are going on in Major League Baseball that changes the whole nature of it. And bits of this are threads that go through the book as different players bring up different aspects of that.
That's fantastic. I mean, what an excellent summary and so many things to consider about how baseball got to where it is today. And a lot of people don't realize how, drastically different it was even in the 1950s. They might recognize the names. I had one card from 1959 that I currently have, this nice 5.5 Yogi Berra. But you recognize the name Yogi Berra, but you don't think about how different the league was at that time. So the fact that this book can capture that and put you in to see some of those stories is something that I'm sure a lot of the readers are going to be thrilled about. So I want to next ask you, where can we get this book? Because I understand it's out now. It's ready to be read.
Yes. There are a couple of easy ways to get the book. The first is from the publisher McFarland and Company. And you can go to the McFarland website, which is mcfarlandbooks.com. That's McFarland books.com. And if you search for the title of the book, When Baseball Was Still Tops, or my name, it'll take you to a page at which you can order. I think it still says pre-order, but that's not updated. The books are being shipped. And the book is also available through Amazon. So that's another easy way for readers to find it and get it.
Gotcha. And again, the title of the book is When Baseball Was Still Tops, and the author, of course, is here, Phil Coffin. So, Phil, I have 5 minutes left before the episode shuts down. I wanted to also give a shout out to Sabre. Can you give the audience a direction on if they're interested in joining, where they can go, and any more details about that?
Sure. Easiest way is to go to the Sabre website, which is sabr.org, and you can sign up there. There are chapters around the country. There is a nice, vibrant chapter here in New Jersey. There's a vibrant chapter in New York City, but there are chapters in cities all across the country. So readers can find a way to connect. And the Sabre is having a membership drive right now.
Okay. And is there an annual fee to be a member of it? What does that look like?
It is, and I can't remember what it is. I don't know whether it's $50, $65. I'm not sure what the membership fee is, but yes, there is an annual membership fee.
I'll definitely have to check that out, because as somebody who loves baseball history and research, I think it would be something I would love to be a part of. The last few minutes here, I wanted to give the audience an opportunity to hear recommendations from you. I loved having the opportunity to hear some book recommendations from you. And I know it's hard to do because you're a baseball fan through and through. I even asked for the audience to know, I asked what his favorite baseball team was. And he said, I am a Major League Baseball fan. So he's just wearing the MLB logo when he's going to games. He does not have a favorite team, which I think is pretty emblematic of just how true you are to the game and the history of it. But I would love to hear if you could give your top 3 favorite baseball books ever for the audience to check out, on top of course, When Baseball Was Still Tops.
Right.
That's number 1. And let's do the other 3.
The book I probably read more than any other is Ball 4 by Jim Bouton.
Sure.
It was not the first of the diary kind of books. Jim Brosnan had one, but Ball 4 is tremendous read. Tells you what it's like, or was like then, to be a Major League Baseball player. It's by far my favorite. A couple of years ago, Joe Posnanski put out a book called Baseball 100. His take on the top 100 players in baseball from 100 to 1. He initially did it online, then put it in a book. You can argue with him all day long about the cards, but the essays are unbelievably good read. It's worth picking up to read. It's a long book, but worth every minute you spend with it. I'm going to give you 4 here.
Okay.
One, because I'm fascinated by the Negro Leagues. The book that got me started was When Only the Ball Was White by Robert Peterson.
Right.
It's not the only book that you can find about the Negro Leagues, but it was a great starter for me. And I have about 15 books on the Negro Leagues now because it's just such a fascinating era. And the last one I'd like to mention is Bill James and his Historical Baseball Abstracts. He's actually put out 3 versions of it. And from the first to the third, the book changes considerably. It's like 800 pages of baseball nerddom.
Sure.
And it's history, it's funny stories. I mean, in some ways, what I have done sort of steals some of the approach that he took. And he goes through decade by decade in the game, and it tells you a lot about the history and about the game and about those who played it, but has a very statistical bent because he's the guy who came up with sabermetrics as a term, and he was an early Saber member, but his books are really worth a read.
Sure. Well, Phil, I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast today. This was super awesome. Something I've been looking forward to for a while. And again, congratulations on the book.
Thanks, Gordy.
Incredible accomplishment. So again, for all those that are watching, you can get When Baseball Was Still Tops out today at Amazon and the McFarland Publishing Company. Check it out. Copies are available. And please let me know what you guys think. I'm going to get a copy here soon, and I'm excited to hear what the audience thinks. So, Phil, thank you so much again, man. It was an honor getting to talk some baseball history with you.
It's always great to talk baseball, Gordy.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, Gordy.
So that's a wrap on the podcast this week. Again, thank you to Phil Coffin. And again, his book, When Baseball Was Still Tops, is out now. You guys can check that in the show notes of this episode if you'd like to purchase his books. As a reminder, guys, if you enjoyed this podcast, whether you're listening on YouTube or Spotify, be sure to subscribe, follow, and leave a positive comment and review on the channel. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you guys shortly.